Okay, this is kind of exciting. Welcome, I am Jamie East, and we normally do Virgin Radio Classic albums here, as you well know. This time round, the gentleman sat opposite me have got such an illustrious and amazing collection of songs that they've written and recorded over the years. It was impossible to pick one single album that fully kind of did them justice. So for the first time, welcome to Virgin Radio's Classic Artists, and I'm really pleased to welcome Andy MacKay and Phil Manzenera from Roxy Music. How are you guys?
We're good, thank you.
Very
nice
good,
to be
thanks.
here.
We were just talking a bit before we started recording, and I asked you whether you were bored of talking about these songs yet.
Not really. I mean, there are a lot of them. I mean, and I find I forget some of them. I mean, I don't think many people actually play their own albums that often.
Yeah.
You know, when one of them gets played, or there's some reason for it, then you hear it. So that particularly some of the middle albums, as it were, there are tracks that I'd completely forgotten.
Yes, I don't think I've spoken about any of these tracks particularly at all in the last 10 years, because we're always doing new things, so we always tend to be talking about the new stuff.
It was always quite important to you at the time, though, wasn't it, to be looking forward rather than kind of being reflective on the past?
Yeah.
You're quite you're a progressive kind of art rock band, would that be correct?
What was it? Well, the ad that you put in to get me
Yes.
said Avant rock group. I thought that was rather good. No one's ever picked up on that.
Yeah.
I think perhaps we should get all the journalists to reclassify prog rock, art rock, avant rock.
Avant rock, yeah.
I think Bowie would have liked to be in that as well.
Yeah.
So we just heard Virginia Plain, which I mean, it's still a rabble rouser of a stomper, isn't it? And talk to us a bit about the early days of Roxy Music, because you know I became kind of a fan of Roxy Music, I guess, later through hearing from my parents' records collections and whatnot. And by which time, I was always trying to work out a way of describing to you. I always used to hear Roxy Music whenever my mum and dad would have a dinner party, and you kind of encapsulated the aspirations of a lot of Middle England of that time, where they wanted to be smoking the cigarettes out through a big long holder and wearing a white tuxedo, and all the ladies wanted to have shiny lip gloss and very floaty dresses, and you sold the whole dream.
It's funny because the fans, to a large extent, invented a kind of Roxy look that somehow it seemed appropriate, but quite early on, girls would turn up wearing black gloves and with lace veils, and none of which was actually specifically part of any of the actual Roxy artwork, but it somehow seemed something that they kind of created. And also we had a lot of kind of quasi-gay young men, I think, particularly from industrial towns and things, where you know, early 70s was still a difficult time for people in a lot of households, and that was another thing that gave us sort of a style. You know, obviously Brian was there, and we were leading style because we were interested in fashion. But
the sound in particular, Phil. I mean, something like Virginia Plain. Was it? How easy was it for that to come to? Because you came, the members at the time, you came from quite different walks of life, and you know, some of you, like Brian, was classed as a technician rather than a musician when he first joined.
You mean Brian Eno?
Yes.
Well, I think what Virginia Plain shows, it's like a sort of haiku, musical haiku, because it's made up of very, very simple parts, but each part really shows what each musician was about. And to condense it all into 2 minutes 52 seconds, you get the unique stylized singing, you get Andy playing oboe and saxophone, you get me playing sort of Velvet Underground type guitar, Eno playing a bit of synth, Paul Thompson driving rock, and it still sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And of course that was recorded after we'd actually recorded the first album, so it wasn't on the first album. We needed a single. We went in, you know, it was 2 minutes 52 of just pure, the essence of Roxy, really.
Yeah, and it was a chance for me to actually play a lot of oboe. You know, because my first.
You don't get much of that in the charts.
No, I mean my first instrument was oboe, and I kind of switched to sax, you know, when I was about 18, 19, or I started playing sax as well. But yeah, I did really want to sort of push that oboe thing, and yeah, to this day, I don't think there's any other rock records that actually. They may have a bit of oboe here and there in sort of orchestral things, but it's, you know, it's nice to have it.
The oboe stands proud in Virginia Plain.
It jumps out a little bit, yeah.
Take me through the writing process. What was it like? There were a lot of personalities in the band, a lot of, I would imagine, a lot of opinions as to which way the sound should be heading or was heading. How did something like this take? We're going to listen to "Love Is the Drug" in a minute. Take me through, if you can remember, how did that kind of come about?
Well, there was quite a big difference between the first album and subsequent albums, because the first album we'd rehearsed a bunch of songs, which were basically songs that Brian had. And he was kind of, in a way, he was finding his form as a songwriter, because they're pretty weird, some of the songs on the first album.
Yeah.
And because he was sort of a step ahead of us, it was his house that we rehearsed in, and he had the instruments and he had the songs. So we sort of went along with Brian coming up with the chords and the structures and the words. So when we went in the studio for the first album, we were playing arrangements that we'd actually kind of worked on for quite a long time. That never really happened again. After that, we go into the studio with fairly simple structures for songs. You know, a few chords that Brian had played, you know, a lot of black notes, because he tended to, you know, that's the way he wrote. And we would then sort of create the track instrumentally by adding riffs or drum patterns or sax parts, you know, usually in the absence of any lead vocal or top line.
Wow, that's unusual.
Yeah, so for instance, take "Love Is the Drug." You know, you had a chord sequence, which I remember we rehearsed in a little rehearsal studio in St. Peter's Square,
yes,
actually. And we had different bass players on all the albums. And on that particular album, we had Johnny Gustafsson. And to those chords of yours, he played this amazing bass line. And it sort of suggested almost like a sort of reggae type sort of groove, which then we just worked up in the studio completely with no idea of what the top line or the words were going to be. And so we finished it all off. Brian took it away to try and come up with the top line. And I've got a visual of being in Air Studios and seeing, you know, the day when he came in. I said, okay, well, we all just stood there. I said, right, okay, let's see what you got. And he just sang it. And it just said, wow, that's a hit straight away. It was just fantastic. And that was the sort of weird sort of way that we worked. Then it could be fantastic, successful or not. We
had also had a lot of time to work on the instrumentals, I mean, on the the track without the vocal, because we had studios block booked really. So I think we would sometimes we could do long sessions.
The luxury of the old ye olde record album
exactly.
budgets,
And Chris Thomas was our producer by the time we got to Love Is the Drug, and so we could take that luxury of experimenting. So things like we would play around with the snare sound. We'd use phasing and things on guitars. We double track the saxes. I don't know how many tracks of sax are on that little riff. I remember it drove me mad doing it. And Chris, a very demanding person, he'd say, "Just do it once more." And I'd say, "Well, it's pretty much tracked." No, just like slightly out. So that was So we got textures that I think you wouldn't get if you'd gone in with the vocals to start with. I think you probably have approached it differently.
And of course, the phrase "love is the drug." What a great line.
The downside is, I don't think at that time, as members of the band, we didn't get credited with songwriting.
No.
So Brian obviously got all the credit. I co-wrote "Love Is the Drug," so I got some credit. But in the first two albums, everything is credited to Brian, which in the old-fashioned way that publishing worked. That was the way it worked. The writer was the person who wrote the words and the kind of
top line.
The top line, basically.
Yeah, nowadays it's a hugely much more collaborative effort.
It's down to a band to argue their own case, and we didn't do it. So no point in worrying about it now. But it's why I always feel Roxy songs are our songs. Whether whoever was credited with actually writing them.
Is that what it was? A major six?
Yeah. Say it's
the Beatles.
Yeah, it's the same. Hard Day's Night.
Absolutely.
And of course, Chris Thomas, who was our producer, worked with George Martin and the Beatles from the White Album.
I was going to ask you about Chris. I mean, he's such a tour de force in music, and a lot of the music that I've grown up with and loved throughout my life. And you mentioned, you kind of hinted at his kind of process. What was it? Can you take me through? We're going to talk about Dance Away in a minute, which is a really interesting one that I wanted to touch upon. And I chose this one specifically. You hinted at being in the studio with Chris Thomas, who's one of the most prolific and brilliant kind of record producers that we've had. Take me through what being in the studio was like in terms of, was it fairly traditional? You mentioned creating layers and soundscapes, but did you kind of go in there? Was it drums and then the bass, or did you perform live as a unit as much as you could?
Well, it changed because over the 10-year period between the first album and Avalon, technology changed.
Yeah.
So the method of working changed. But with Chris Thomas, it was the traditional George Martin, Abbey Road style of recording, which most people did with a band. Go in, they all play together a backing track, and then, as did the Beatles, and then you refine each part and till you get it just right. So, but he was the master of that, and he had learned from the top.
Was there a feeling that technology finally caught up with you, rather than the other way around? Because
not from a recording point of view. No.
No, I mean we started when the 16-track sort of era had just started.
Yeah.
So that even the first album was done on 16-track, and a very short time before, people were still using 8-track or 4-track. But particularly when we got to the third and fourth albums, there was a huge luxury in having a studio where you had an engineer, an assistant engineer, a tape op, and a producer, as well as the band. So, nowadays most people have a kind of engineer, producer, or they're doing some of it themselves. So yeah, you did sort of approach it differently, and you took advantage of chance things. You might find there was a great echo in the corridor, or that somehow the drums sounded good if you left something on top of them, or something. All sorts of little things.
Yeah.
So,
in terms of synths and stuff like that, obviously, kind of in the early days, it was just on the burgeoning kind of industry, really. But I guess 10 years later, it was
a different, whole different ballgame. And by the time we get to Flesh and Blood and Avalon, I'm recording studio. They'd invented all sorts of new whizzy things, drum boxes.
Yeah.
It sounds pathetic now, just drum boxes.
But they were a key part of the sound. I mean, we're going to
and dance.
We're going to talk about Dance Away now. We're going to listen to that in a second. The opening of that is I guess a kind of bossa nova kind of from a boss drum machine or something.
I mean, synthesizers changed from being basically a non-keyboard instrument. I mean, so that although Eno played a lot more music than sometimes people give him credit for, but most of it was done with a joystick and turning a knob rather than a keyboard.
Looked terrifyingly unmusic-like.
And from Eddie Jobson on, who joined the band on the third album, by then synthesizers had become essentially keyboard instruments. They were a sort of glorified organ. And so you lost something there. I mean, recently I've still got the original VCS3 synthesizer that we used.
Wow.
in my flat at the moment. And
there's a pension.
And I use it as we used to, just doing funny sounds. And
wow.
it's
Well, there was only really the Floyd and us who used it in that way. Rick Wright tended to use a bit like that, and also, as with them, the Farfisa.
Yeah.
So that's really all that was available, 72 to 74.
People who played the Moog tended to be keyboard players who just liked the sounds rather than. So the VCS3 was very unusual.
And with Dance Away, I think lyrically, it's a proper smooth one, isn't it? It's got one of my favourite lyrics of all time. In it, which is the "You're dressed to kill and guess who's dying" is just one of the most perfect lyrics that you get in pop music. It kind of really kind of painted that smooth kind of image for you.
Yeah, I think Brian's songwriting had sort of really had changed quite a lot by the time he had learned the craft of songwriting.
Was he playing a character when he was singing those songs, or was that how Brian was?
I think he always played the same character, which was sort of like he was, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, it's the unrequited lover, kind of, the same sort of ambience crops up again and again. And Brian became a very good songwriter, and I think some of his, on some of his solo albums, there's some very good, very well crafted songs. They lose some of the kind of charm and weirdness of things like The Bogus Man. The lyrics of The Bogus Man is on his way as fast as he can run. I mean, that's it. It's a bit different from He's Dressed to Kill.
Dance Away, when we had a break, I don't know, 75 till we did Manifesto, which had the album Manifesto, which had Dance Away on it. Dance Away was a track that he had hanging around from his solo stuff. And so when we got back together, and we had no idea what the hell we should be doing, because punk had started and we didn't even know whether we were relevant or whatever. And it was just one of the many tracks that we tried, and we all contributed material. But then we went to record in New York, and Ahmet Ertegun used to pop into the studio every night at Atlantic Studios, and he loved that track. And I always remember him coming in. He'd come in after some posh do somewhere in a bow tie and a DJ and stuff. And it was the time of disco stuff.
Yeah.
He said, "You should put fours on the bass drum." And we said, nodded. And when he went out, he said, "We're not bloody putting fours on the sod, the fucking disco rubbish," or whatever. Anyway, he insisted on doing it. And we didn't. So we mixed it, and we were in the mastering room in Victoria, in Stratton Place, and we were mastering the bloody album. And who should walk in was Ahmet Ertegun. So I told you to put fours on the bass drum, and so the whole thing halted. And eventually we did put fours on the bass drum, and it became a hit.
Wow!
Yeah.
And so.
But it really gave it that drive, didn't it? He was right.
He was right, absolutely right. And that saved our bacon, quite
frankly. We needed
a
hit,
And Memories of More Than This as well, because I think they're quite similar in terms of mood.
Yeah, and the other one is Oh Yeah, which I think is the other sort of... They feel to me a tiny bit overwritten, actually.
Right.
But they did.
Was that because of the time, because of how everyone was making music at the time, or?
I think it's also, we were on our sixth albums, sixth or seventh album. You have to sort of, dig a bit deeper to come up with stuff.
Actually, I'll tell you what. I think Avalon was our 8th album.
Was it? Right.
I think that was our last album, to tell you the truth.
Too many to count.
But by that stage, we had, in effect, our own studio, which was my studio. And so we had far too much time to spend on it. Mm. But Avalon was a totally different album to everything else. And so, the whole band, everything changed. And because of the way technology changed.
So you hinted at Avalon album, you had every musician's dream was the luxury of having their own studio where there was no one watching the clock. That's a curse as much as a blessing, isn't it? Because sometimes you need to be told when to stop.
You do, but we didn't just use it exclusively, because we would go to New York as well, to the power station, where Bob Clearmountain, the great Bob Clearmountain, worked, and do overdubs and use some American musicians, and he was going to mix it. And just incidentally, he mixed the whole album, 2 tracks a day, 5 days, 3 hours a track, everything on Avalon. He's an absolute genius. And when you're talking about using echoes and things, there was a fire exit just in his little studio, and that's where he used to use his special echo.
It is Avalon. It does sound amazing. Anytime I listen to test pressings, I always take a copy of Avalon. I kind of play it. And
that's your ground zero. That's
and that's the one I use to sort of, apart from being very familiar with it, but it is.
Well, and of course the other thing, that the reason why it also sounds extra good is because they had just invented CDs, and it was one of the first releases on a CD.
Wow.
So it's the first time you could actually hear that quality of sound through your speakers. And so we were very lucky that it coincided. We'd spent a lot of time working on the sounds, both at Gallery in London and in New York, and the great mixing engineer, and then to have it come out on CD rather than the tyranny of vinyl, and whether the vinyl could be dodgy in different countries, and bad vinyl and good vinyl, and keeping so it did all contribute to Avalon being considered like an amazing sounding album.
Now everyone listens on terrible MP3s that are compressed on cheap headphones. It's a great shame.
Does that drive you mad?
Yeah, it does a bit. Yeah, I think the quality of sound on Spotify things is really disappointing. When you consider just how good it can be, and doing vinyl now is always good, because it just makes you kind of concentrate a bit more, and maybe even just listening a bit harder.
Well, I mean, certainly vinyl helped you guys in terms of album covers. Where you can't get as much joy out of artwork as you could back then, and your album covers were legendary and still are, and they are works of art. Talk to me about the process of pulling those all together. What was that like? I mean, normally they included extremely attractive women, and
the covers were pretty much Brian's domain, because he was the visual artist, and he was particularly liked to really spend a lot of time on that. I think they hold together pretty well. I mean, we were always happy. I mean, we had some ideas usually about particularly the back covers and how we was presented and what our images were, but
that's right. There was a great team of people involved as well. There was always Anthony Price, the fashion designer, Nick DeVille, who had done fine arts at Newcastle with Brian, and always a famous photographer and a fantastic model. So, they had it covered. Those guys were really good, and it was almost like a band.
You were pretty much the most glamorous band in the world at that point. Did it feel like it in the eye of the storm?
I don't know.
No, you don't really think about that. You just looking forward. We had gigs to do, we had albums to make, stuff to get out, and normal life to lead.
Also,
plus we were doing hundreds of other things, all of us, right from 73, 74 onwards. And your first solo album was when?
74.
4, yeah.
Yeah, we were always working on lots of different projects.
And was Roxy music always the heartbeat that ran through it? Was there always an understanding that at some point, the birds would come back to the nest?
There was no understanding at all. It was just a sort of rudderless ship that just kept going, and still is a rudderless ship. And that's what's sort of good about it, is that it's just there's no plan, you know, to world domination. That's probably, we probably could have been bigger or whatever if we'd had a plan, but we all want to just follow our noses.
We never made any money out of touring. I mean, as most bands didn't.
No.
I remember the very last tour, the Avalon tour, we had some sponsorship, and it was the first time we'd had it, and I think it broke even. And every other tour cost money, so you had to make albums to get some income. And that you were doing a tour basically to sell your album. And we were lucky because when the CD thing came in, a lot of people who'd bought our records on vinyl bought them again so they could listen to them on CD. So that helped. But basically, if we didn't do an album every couple of years, you know, the income was likely to sort of diminish a little bit, which is why we also did other projects, partly because we loved music and loved doing it. You know,
which is totally the opposite of now.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, you'd make the albums to sell the tickets. I mean, it's such an incredibly kind of rich seam of music throughout the time that you guys were around. Was there much competition? Was it quite a competitive market out there? You know, you were talking, you know, other bands that were kicking off around that time. Although there was never really another avant rock kind of band other than Roxy Music, it was pretty fierce out there.
Yeah, but you didn't really see it like that. You know, you had your job to do. You know, you had your band. You had a sort of obligation to try and do something different with every album, and you couldn't really worry about what other people were doing.
Who were your peers at the time? Which bands did you kind of knock around with? Yeah.
I'm trying to
What's
think.
anyone? I can't remember.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. And just before we go on to the last song, which is Angel Eyes, just very quickly, you were talking about kind of punk coming along and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They all loved Roxy Music, though. The punks,
did they?
You know,
They never admitted it.
No, well, I wanted to tell you a great anecdote, which was Marco Peroni, who's the guitarist and songwriter from Adam and the Ants, told me, was that he was on the first US tour with Adam and the Ants, and they just sold out, I think, the Roxy or something like that, and they headed back to the hotel, and it was 5 o'clock in the morning, and they were all kind of knackered and going to bed, and the lift opened, and out of the lift stepped the entire Roxy Music band, all of you guys in tuxedos, cigarette holders, ready for a night out at 5 o'clock in the morning, and you just sashayed past them in the lobby, and they were all looking at you as if like, what the hell? So the punk kind of loved your attitude, though, and the music as well.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, subsequently, having met lots of musicians who were around at that time, I didn't know them. Yes, they're all they were big fans.
Do you hear your influence much now? When you're listening to music now, do you think, oh, okay?
No.
No?
I don't.
That's very honest.
No, I think, I mean, I think some of Radiohead, I hear only Roxy in that quite often.
Really?
Yeah.
And just, we're going to play Angel Eyes, and it's the version that I think most people know is the single version. Could you just kind of, why did you remix it from the album version to what is essentially, I guess, almost a disco tune?
Yeah, it was the first sort of proper disco thing that we did. It was, I don't know whose idea it was. Was it Rhett who decided to remix it, or?
No, well, actually, Bob Clearmountain mixed it because we sent it over to him, but we re-recorded it.
Right.
Because Dance Away had been a hit. We needed a follow-up to that. And we looked around on the album and we said, why don't we do your track? And so we went into Basing Street. I've got a visual on it downstairs, and we re-recorded it with like blinks and plonks, and then sent it off to Bob Clearmountain, I remember being in south of France or something when the test pressing arrived, and I just couldn't believe it. It was absolutely great.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's better than the album version, really. I mean, the album version is kind of interesting, but I think that the single version's sort of...
Well, the album version's got balls, but this one's got a bit more
danceability.
Sway. Yeah, danceability. Yeah. Well, let's leave it on what must have been one of the first kind of dance classics. It's Angel Eyes from Roxy Music. Andy and Phil, thank you so much for talking to us. And,
thank you.
Thank you.
The best music all day. Virgin Radio.